Good evening to all. Today we are starting the new system, which is gastroenterology and hepatology. So today's first class will be on approach to gastroenterology and some basics about examination of abdomen. So before going to GI tract as such, there are a few physiological and anatomical points which we should remember before going to the diseases as such. We know very well the GIT is made up of 4 layers: the mucosa, submucosa, the muscle layer, and the serosa. Each has its own function and it correlates to some diseases also. For example, we know the mucosa is responsible for enzyme secretion. The enzyme is needed for digestion and absorption, but this enzyme secretion is guided by many local hormones. Similarly, the muscle layer is needed for gut motility. This gut motility is guided by a special nervous system called as the enteric nervous system, which is also called as the fourth nervous system. Apart from central nervous system, PNS and ANS, we have fourth nervous system called as enteric nervous system, which is very extensive. The function of these gut enzyme secretion, which is controlled by local hormones, and the gut motility, which is controlled by enteric nervous system, is together for absorbing nutrients and for excreting waste. If there is any abnormality of these problems, we'll have diseases. The newer updates which are coming about GIT talks about gut microbiome. That is all the bacteria, the beneficial bacteria which is present in the GIT. Any abnormality, that is if this normal GI microbiome is changed, it is called as dysbiosis. We know very well when the normalcy changes, it leads to some amount of immunity or inflammation happening there, which can also cause diseases. Another important aspect of GIT is it has an extensive vascular supply. So the things which I have highlighted in caps, the enzyme secretion, local hormones, gut motility, enteric nervous system, dysbiosis, immune response, vascular supply, these 7 things are needed for the normal functioning of the GIT. If this is abnormal, this will lead to some diseases. So the diseases which we are going to discuss further will have all these 7 terms in common. So the first chapter of Harrison classifies the disease of GIT based on the things which I mentioned earlier. I told you the function of GIT is to digest and absorb nutrients. If there's any problem with that, it can occur due to any of the following which I mentioned. It could be an enzyme defect, it could be a hormone defect, it could be a gut dysbiosis, or a motility defect, etc. For example, lactase is an enzyme which is produced by the GIT, which breaks down lactose into glucose and fructose. Sorry, glucose and galactose, which is needed for absorption. If this enzyme is deficient, this will not be absorbed. Similarly, gastrin is needed for normal acid secretion in the stomach. If there is an excess acid secretion, that's called as Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. There will be excess gastric transit, which impairs with digestion and absorption. Similarly, there's one example of gut dysbiosis, SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. When there's more bacteria growing, it impairs with the normal digestion and absorption. Other examples of this kind include infectious enteritis and inflammatory bowel disease. And we know celiac disease is and some other malabsorption syndromes also impair with digestion and absorption. The common factor for any disease of this category will present with diarrhea and malabsorption. But the thing is, taking the food is not digested and absorbed. So taking the food will aggravate diarrhea and restricting food will relieve diarrhea in this case. Another entity of disease of GIT will be impaired secretion. So again, impaired secretion can be either increased or reduced secretion of a particular enzyme or hormone, and dysbiosis can also be associated. Like previously mentioned, Zollinger-Ellison syndrome is excess secretion of gastrin. VIPoma is excess secretion of vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. Atrophic gastritis is absent secretion of HCl, hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Similarly, infections like giardiasis and SIBO can also cause diarrhea due to impaired secretion. So this also can present with the diarrhea. That is when there's excess secretion of hormone or enzyme, this also can present with diarrhea. But this is not associated with food intake. Here, food restriction will not restrict the symptom. So till now, we have discussed 2 categories of diseases which present with diarrhea, either impaired digestion or absorption or impaired secretion. One is increased by taking food, the one is not affected by taking food. So if we finish the hormones, we finished about enzymes. Now the third thing is about gut transit. Change of gut transit can be either increased gut motility or reduced gut motility. It can be a mechanical obstruction like hernia obstruction, etc. Or it could be a pure motor disorder which affects either the enteric nervous system or the muscle. A motor disorder of the esophagus is called as achalasia. A same motor disorder of the stomach is called as gastroparesis. Reduced motor action of the intestine is called as intestinal pseudo-obstruction or ileus. Similarly, we have one type of primary constipation, which is called as slow transit constipation, where there is a reduced motility of the colon. Other examples of this category will be post-vagotomy dumping syndrome, and the hypertransit syndrome will be inflammatory bowel syndrome. So these two disorders can cause diarrhea. So three things over. Now the fourth thing is dysbiosis and immune disorder. When the gut microbiome gets changed, it leads to abnormal immune response and diseases. So examples of this will be eosinophilic esophagitis, eosinophilic gastroenteritis, lymphocytic gastroenteritis, and the common inflammatory bowel disease, which we know, celiac disease and ulcerative colitis, comes under this category. The fourth point which I mentioned was there's excess vascularity of the intestine. Hence, this can be affected commonly, either by embolization or thrombosis or a chronic ischemia of the intestine. And apart from this, we have neoplasms, something which does not fit into any of these categories. A problem with hormone, a problem with enzyme, a problem with motility, or a problem with dysbiosis, we call it as a functional disorder of GI tract, which I'll discuss further. So having discussed the basic mechanisms of what happens normally and what happens abnormally, now how to approach any GI disease. So the aim of classifying any disease in any system is to find out the etiology. The etiology can be classified such. Generally, we classify as congenital, traumatic, infective, inflammatory, toxic, vascular, neoplastic. We approach this by history, physical examination, investigations, and treatment. All the chapters which we are going to discuss further in the next classes will be based on the same approach. This is just a summary of everything which we are going to deal further. So what are the things we are going to ask in history? History is focused mainly on two things. One, what part of the intestine is involved? And second thing, what may be the probable etiology? So how to identify the site involved from the history? If the patient complains, there are many symptoms. I just mentioned few of these symptoms here. Dysphagia, difficulty in swallowing. This commonly attributes to the esophagus, which is upper gastrointestinal tract. If the patient complains of nausea and vomiting, it is commonly localized to the stomach, and it can also occur in some non-GI disorders. Pain can be localized to anywhere along the GI tract. Diarrhea can be localized to the small bowel or large bowel. Hematemesis or melena, as we know, it is an upper GI symptom. Hematochezia is bleeding from the lower GI, that is after the ligament of Treats. Jaundice is a hepatobiliary syndrome. So based on the complaint, we can localize what may be the site probably which may be involved. And again, I told you what may be the etiology is the next question to ask in history. We can localize it by just asking two questions. One thing is the time of onset, whether it is acute or chronic. The second thing, what is the relation of the symptom to food? For example, any acute symptom occurring in relation to GI tract is commonly due to infection, inflammation, toxin related or ischemia. For example, the food poisoning commonly which we come across is a diarrhea or abdominal pain, sudden onset, which is caused by preformed toxins which is present in the food. Similarly, a chronic complaint of GI tract may be due to inflammation, commonly due to inflammatory bowel disease, neoplastic, or maybe functional. Similarly, I told you about the relationship of a complaint with food. Any symptom which is aggravated on food intake may be due to an obstructive symptom, obstructive etiology, ischemic symptom, inflammatory bowel disease, functional or a malabsorption syndrome. A peculiar disease which is relieved on taking food will be a duodenal ulcer. So by history, I haven't touched the entire details of what all things to be asked, but the aim of history taking is to localize what organ is involved and what may be the probable etiology by asking the time and the aggravating factor. So the crux of today's class is about the general examination of gastrointestinal system. So we all know general examinations generally done in daylight as compared to an artificial light. Hutchison mentions the importance of this because a mild icterus of the skin can be picked up in a daylight compared to an artificial light. The abdomen should be exposed completely from the xiphoid sternum to the groin. Groin should be exposed. And never forget to examine the genitals, the breast, and the left supraclavicular fossa. We all know the 9 regions of the abdomen. The genitals is called as the 10th region of the abdomen, and the left supraclavicular fossa is the 11th region of the abdomen. So never close an examination of the abdomen without examining these things. So general examination can be classified as three things: a head to foot examination, anthropometry, and vitals. This approach is actually given in Hutchison how to approach a case of general examination. So it classify it as 12 points. Whenever we are doing a head to foot examination, always see the general appearance, the posture, stance, and gait, the nutrition status, the hydration status, including edema in the patient, any skin findings such as hyperpigmentation, pallor, icterus, cyanosis, scars, alopecia, any skin lesions, skin swellings, etc. Any eye changes such as pallor, icterus, KF ring. The face should be looked for. This is not important in gastrointestinal system, but more important in cardiology to look for any deformities in the face, the oral cavity and pharynx, any abnormalities in hands, any abnormalities in nails, then lymph nodes, feet, and some special things to look for examination. I will explain each of this in relevance to the GIT. So in general appearance, what we normally see is how is the patient? Does he look well? Does he look sick? If it is sick, whether it is mildly sick or is very severely ill. For example, a patient with hepatic encephalopathy, by looking at the general examination, we can classify which grade of hepatic encephalopathy he belongs to. For example, if the patient is anxious, with a shortened attention span, with a trivial lack of awareness, he comes under a grade 1 hepatic encephalopathy. If he's really lethargic or apathetic, with some personality changes and inappropriate behavior, he comes under grade 2. If he's really confused with a gross disorientation, he comes under grade 3. And is comatose, he comes under a grade 4. So this is something about general appearance of something which we can infer from the general appearance of the patient. The next category will be a posture, gait, and stance. We are not dealing with stance and gait here. We are dealing with the posture. A patient with peritonitis will feel comfortable when he is lying with abdomen relaxed. So he'll lie supine with legs drawn up with minimal inspiratory effort, because a small inspiratory effort is going to increase the pain. Small movement of the abdomen is going to increase the pain. So he'll be lying flat. So hope you all will be able to recognize what this may be. This is a patient with acute pancreatitis where the pain will be relieved on leaning forward position. Similarly, a patient with massive ascites can have orthopnea, so he'll be uncomfortable in lying down position. He may be in a propped up position. A patient who is in platypnea, we all know platypnea occurs in hepatopulmonary syndrome, which is a complication of cirrhosis, where he'll be dyspneic on sitting position and he'll be lying down mostly. So this is about the posture. We can infer a few things about the posture of the patient. Now coming to the nutritional status. A nutritional problem with nutrition can be overnutrition or undernutrition. We are not bothered about overnutrition here. Whenever we speak about nutrition, the question always comes about the terms of built and nourishment. Built and nourishment are always subjective terms. So to actually settle about the nutritional status of the patient, we have to mention about the BMI, the height, weight, BMI, and a few other measurements, which I'll discuss later. So 2 words, when a patient is overnourished, we call it as obesity. Obesity can be a central or apple-shaped obesity, or it could be a pear-shaped obesity. Differentiating this is important because central obesity is associated with metabolic syndrome. Central obesity is the patient has bulkiness or more fat deposition over the chest and the abdomen, whereas a pear-shaped obesity or a gynecoid pattern of obesity is there will be more fat over the hip and thigh regions. Or undernutrition, the patient is very much malnourished on examination or very much emaciated. He may have a malabsorption syndrome, or he may have a chronic infection or an inflammation or a malignancy. So as I told you, the terms built and nourishment which we use are only subjective terms. To objectively assess the original nutrition of the patient, we always have to calculate BMI, which we'll consider again in anthropometry. Just see the last column. For Asian people, the BMI less than 18.5 is called as underweight. 18.5 to 22.9 is normal. 23 to 24.9 is overweight. 25 to 29.9 is obese. More than 30, BMI is called as morbidly obese. Whereas in non-Asian population, more than 40 is called as morbidly obese. So when we look at the nutrition, we should always also have a look at the hydration status of the patient. We know that one of the common complaints of gastrointestinal tract will be nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. A severe hypovolemia can lead to sunkenized dry mucous membrane and reduced skin turgor. McLeod mentions we have to look for skin turgor on the anterior chest wall rather than on the forearm. A skin pinch which is slowly returning more than 2 seconds suggests dehydration, severe dehydration. Similarly, there's a hypervolemic state which occurs in cirrhosis as a complication of cirrhosis, where we have peripheral edema, ascites, etc. So we have seen the general appearance of the patient. We have specifically looked for the posture of the patient, and we have seen the general nutritional status of the patient. Now coming to each organ as such, we'll have a general look at the skin of the patient. A hyperpigmentation is something which we commonly come across. In relation to GIT, a hyperpigmentation is seen in hemochromatosis. We all know the excess iron will deposit in the liver, will deposit in the pancreas, will deposit in the skin. Deposition of this pigment in the skin will cause bronze discoloration. Deposition in the pancreas will cause diabetes. We call it as bronze diabetes. And deposition in liver will cause cirrhosis. So one cause of young age cirrhosis, one cause of young age liver disease will be a hemochromatosis. Look for skin pigmentation in these cases. So coming to the other signs which we commonly know and we commonly look for, pallor. So pallor we all know can be seen in the skin, but it is best assessed in the conjunctiva, palmar creases and face. The next thing I have mentioned in CAPS, because we commonly confuse. The presence of pallor does not always mean it is anemia, because a patient with excess sympathetic drive with the cutaneous vasoconstriction may be pale without the presence of anemia. And the absence of pallor does not rule out the presence of anemia, because a patient with anemia who's having a flushing at that time due to any drug intake or so may not look to be a paler in spite of having anemia. We commonly look for nail bed pallor, but McLeod mentions nail bed pallor lacks diagnostic value in anemia because there are many other conditions which can cause a white nail rather than pallor, like terry nail, leukonekia, lindsay nail, etc., which I'll mention again. So the best place to look for pallor will be a conjunctiva, palmar crease and face. So you can see the picture here. The anterior rim of the lower eyelid is looked for in pallor. So what are the causes of pallor in GIT? Anemia causes pallor. So any cause of anemia like iron deficiency, B12 or folate deficiency and copper deficiency can also cause anemia. Any acute blood loss or chronic mucosal blood loss can also cause pallor. So we can differentiate the cause of pallor by looking for other signs. For example, presence of Koilonychia, anglostomatitis and glossitis makes the pallor more probable to iron deficiency. So we look for pallor. Now we are looking for icterus. Icterus, we know, is the yellowish pigmentation of the skin and mucous membrane. This can occur commonly in two conditions: hyperkeratonemia and jaundice. Jaundice, we know, is the yellowish discoloration of skin and mucous membrane due to excess of bilirubin which gets deposited in skin. Carotenemia is excess of carotene. So this is icterus. We are seeing in the bulbar conjunctiva and we are seeing in the palm also. But how to differentiate whether it is a hyperkeratonemia or jaundice? Hyperkeratonemia occurs only in the face, palms and soles. That is hyperkeratonemia, the icterus is confined only to the skin. Whereas jaundice, the icterus is confined also to the conjunctiva because the excess bilirubin has a tendency to bind to elastin. So a patient who is generally having yellow throughout, but there is no yellow in the eye, it may be hyperkeratonemia. One common cause of hyperkeratonemia is hypothyroidism. Other causes being excess ingestion of carotene and anorexia nervosa. The cause of jaundice, we know, it's a separate class as such: pre-hepatic, hepatic, and post-hepatic jaundice. The causes being hemolysis, parenchymal liver disease, and biliary obstruction, respectively. So we are coming in the order of, we have seen the skin. Now if we are seeing the eye, in the eye we saw look for pallor, we look for icterus. Now another finding specifically to be looked for in liver disease is KF ring. You know very well, KF ring is one thing which is looked for in Wilson's disease. This table is given in Alagappan, how to differentiate arcus and Ills from KF ring. Arcus and Ills, we know it's a degenerative condition, occurs as a grayish white in color. It is just present internal to the limbus. There's a clear zone of iris around the limbus. Whereas in KF ring, there's no clear zone around this. And arcus and Ills occurs in old age people, whereas Wilson's disease is commonly a disease of the young. And KF ring is better appreciated with a slit lamp examination than by clinical examination. So we have finished the eye examination. We look for pallor, we look for icterus, and we specifically look for a KF ring. Now coming to the oral cavity and oropharynx examination, we can look for specific orders in GIT. Halitosis suspects a poor dental hygiene. This may be important in GIT, but this is more so important in CVS. A poor dental hygiene in a CVS patient can be a risk factor for infective endocarditis. Fetor hepaticus is a mousy smell occurring in patients with severe jaundice due to volatile amine dimethyl sulfide. So can you make this out? This one which I mentioned earlier, iron deficiency anemia, one of the oral manifestations will be a glossy tongue or an ironed out tongue. Remember, iron deficiency causes ironed out tongue. There's no papilla here. The tongue is very smooth. So this is about oral cavity. There's nothing to look for in face, specifically in GIT. Now coming to the next thing, which is about hands. You can see very well the fourth finger and fifth finger are flexed here. This is a Dupuytren's contracture, which is an idiopathic contracture occurring in the limbs. It can occur in many conditions, but in GIT specifically, it is one of the peripheral signs of chronic liver disease. One explanation which is told for this Dupuytren's contracture is excess estrogen occurring in liver cirrhosis can lead to Dupuytren's contracture. So after finishing the hands, we can look at the nails. The nails, the thing which comes immediately into our minds is clubbing. So clubbing in GIT specifically occurs in 4 conditions: celiac disease, chronic liver disease, inflammatory bowel disease, or hepatoma. We know very well how to look at it. The Shamroth window sign. Normally a diamond-shaped window should be present when we approximate the nails of 2 fingers. But if this is absent, we call it as clubbing. Similarly, the interdigital ratio, if it is more than 1, that is, the nail is thicker at the finger is thicker at the nail bed compared to the distal interphalangeal joint, we call it as a clubbing. Clubbing is a rounded proliferation of the tissues at the nail bed. Hope you can make this out. This is a spoon-shaped nail which occurs in iron deficiency. So as I already mentioned earlier, nail bed pallor is not always a sign of anemia. Nail bed pallor can also occur in other diseases like leukonychia, Lindsay nail, and Mewk's nail. A leukonychia is a white spots, ridges, or complete nail discoloration. It can occur in vitamin deficiency or hypoalbuminemia. You can see here the nail is completely white except only the distal tip. Lindsay nail is a white, also called as half and half nail, where there is expansion of the linule. One half of the nail is white, the other half is brown. This occurs typically in CKD. Mewk's line is, this is also a white nail. This is also a white nail, but this is just a white streak or a white groove which is present. This is also a feature of protein loss, maybe due to nephrotic syndrome or due to a non-nephrotic syndrome also. So after looking at the nails, we are left with the lymph nodes. So the lymph node which we specifically have to look for in the case of GIT will be the left supraclavicular fossa, which is the 11th region of the abdomen I told you. That is called as Virchow's node, which is seen in the left supraclavicular fossa. The presence of this node is called as Troisius sign. It's a sign of gastrointestinal and pelvic malignancy. Never confuse Troisius sign with Trousseau syndrome. Trousseau syndrome is also a finding which we have to look for. Specifically, you look for in the lower limbs. It is a recurrent migrating thrombophlebitis which occurs in gastritic and pancreatic adenocarcinoma. So a patient with GI symptom who is having a thrombophlebitis, it could be a paraneoplastic syndrome due to pancreatic adenocarcinoma, where we call it as a Trousseau syndrome. So having finished all this, I told the last point, for any system, we'll have to look for few things specifically. For example, in CVS, we'll have to look for some markers for infective endocarditis. In respiratory system, we'll have to look for markers of tuberculosis. In GIT, we'll have to look for markers of micronutrient deficiencies and stigmata of chronic liver disease. So this is a summary table from Hutchison. Vitamin A deficiency can present in the eye with bite or spots or keratomalacia. Coming to the oral cavity, it presents with vitamin B2 manifestations like anglostomatitis, atrophic glassitis, and magenta tongue. B3 and biotin or B7 can present with skin manifestations like dermatitis. And pallor, I told you, vitamin B12, folic acid, iron, and copper are the 4 minerals which can present with pallor. Ascorbic acid deficiency can be picked up by gingivitis, perifollicular purpura, and hyperkeratosis. What is this perifollicular purpura? We know very well collagen is weak in vitamin C deficiency, that is scurvy. So there'll be bleeding around the hair follicle. That is the reason for perifollicular purpura. Skin bruises can occur in vitamin K deficiency. And chylonychia and iron out tongue occur with iron deficiency. Peristromal, perinasal, perineal. That is peripheral erythema and thin hair occur in zinc deficiency. We call this as acrodermatitis enteropathica. So these are the things we look for. So if you have to look for any specific micronutrient deficiency, again, look from the head to foot. In that, if you are able to pick up a bite or spots like this, or a dry conjunctiva, or a scarred conjunctiva, it could be a vitamin A deficiency. In skin, if you are finding out some dermatitis like a Casal's necklace, it is due to vitamin B3 or a biotin deficiency. And Anglus dermatitis is a feature of B2 riboflavin deficiency. Magenta colored tongue is a feature of glossitis. Iron tongue is a feature of iron deficiency. Chylonychia is a feature of iron deficiency. And coming to the one which we know very well, the stigmata of chronic liver disease. There are many findings, actually around 20 findings are there, but the ones which are mentioned in Hutchison are palmar erythema, Dupuytren's contracture, leukonychia, clubbing, which we already discussed, spider nevi, bruising due to vitamin K deficiency, scratch marks due to jaundice, gynecomastia, testicular atrophy, loss of axillary and pubic hair, bilateral parotid swelling, fetohepaticus, and hepatic flapper, astraxis. These are some of the signs of chronic liver disease. So why all these occur is, in chronic liver disease and liver cirrhosis, the estrogen is not metabolized. So the excess estrogen is going to cause some effects. Excess estrogen is a vasodilator. So it is going to cause spider nevi. It's going to cause palmar erythema due to vasoconstriction. In males, excess estrogen will cause breast enlargement, that is called as gynecomastia. When estrogen is more, testosterone levels get reduced. So we get testicular atrophy. Parotid swelling, there's no specific reason mentioned. And fetohepaticus, I already described due to dimercaptans which are formed. Hepatic flap is a negative myoclonus. We'll see. So this is a picture from Macleod. If you think about A to Z, alphabets, everything can be localized. For example, A stands for alopecia, B for bite or spots, which can occur here. So every alphabet can be localized to something. X for xanthelasma. So spider nevi is again a feature of liver cirrhosis, liver failure symptom. It is actually central arterial, which has some radiating vessels. It is also due to circulating estrogens. Up to 5 spider nevi is normal. More than 5 spider nevi is abnormal. It is commonly seen in the SVC territory. Why spider nevi commonly occurs in the SVC territory? Why an erythema commonly occurs in the palm? The reason mentioned is, in liver cirrhosis, there will be collaterals which are forming, photosystemic shunts which are forming. The entire shunted blood is going into the SVC territory. That is why whatever symptom which we are getting due to excess estrogen occurs in the SVC territory, be it a palmar erythema, be it a flushing, be it a parotid swelling, or be it a spider nevi. The differential diagnosis for this will be a Campbell-De Morgan spot or a venous star. Remember, venous star is a dilated vein. Spider nevi is a dilated arteriole. So we have finished the head to foot examination, starting from the general appearance, the posture of the patient, the nutrition status, the skin examination, eye examination, face, oral cavity, the hands, nails, feet, and lymph nodes. After this, we come to anthropometry. I already told you the subjective terms of built and nourishment are only subjective. We have to confirm nutrition status only by anthropometry. So do a height examination, do a weight examination, calculate BMI. The nourishment can be assessed by something called as triceps skin fold thickness. Normally it should be 12.5 millimeters in males and 16.5 millimeters in female. Less than this, the patient means the patient is having less fat content, he is undernourished. Waist hip ratio is something used to assess obesity. Waist hip ratio should be less than 0.8 in case of females and less than 0.9 in males. I am not discussing obesity now because undernourishment is commonly seen in GI disorders. So vitals. A patient with GI symptom and elevated temperature means he's having some infection, inflammation, or a neoplasm. A patient with a GI symptom with orthostatic hypertension signifies significant blood loss, be it an external loss or an internal blood loss, severe dehydration, sepsis, or an autonomic neuropathy. Looking at the JVP can give a clue at the hydration status. A patient with severe bleeding will have a low JVP. A tachycardia with the GI symptom again suggests a significant blood loss or volume loss. A patient with bradycardia, obstructive jaundice, remember obstructive jaundice commonly presents with bradycardia. Similarly, any patient on beta blockers, any patient with cirrhosis and portal hypertension who's on beta blockers will normally have a lower heart rate. In that case, you think of portal hypertension as such. Abdomen examination comes as two separate classes. Never close an abdominal examination without looking at the other systems, because a patient with abdominal pain may have an inferior wall MI. Patient with nausea and abdominal pain may have a lower lobe pneumonia, because the lower lobe pneumonia is stimulating the diaphragm, which is having somewhat the same nerve supply of the lower esophagus. Hence, abdominal pain and nausea always look at CVS and RS. The patient could have an underlying inferior wall MI. Similarly, in females, any abdominal pain, look for pelvic examination, which could be the source of pain. What are the CNS manifestations of GI symptoms? Remember, any micronutrient deficiency like zinc, chromium, copper, etc., can cause neuropathy. Remember, vitamin E deficiency can cause ataxia. Celiac disease can cause ataxia, and celiac disease can cause myoclonus. So, if at all you have to look for CNS, specifically look for ataxia, neuropathy, and any abnormal movements like myoclonus. Look at the neck, because enlarged thyroid can cause dysphagia. And never close an abdominal examination without doing a perectal examination. Okay, so till now we have discussed what are the important physiological factors which cause a normal GA function and what are abnormalities, and based on history and examination, how to proceed further. Now, the last part of today's class will be how to investigate a case of GI disease and how to go towards treatment. Yes, even a small investigation like a CBC can give a clue regarding a serious underlying disorder. For example, in CBC, patient is having anemia. We know anemia can be due to an iron deficiency or a B12 deficiency, which can indirectly indicate the patient is having an underlying GI mucosal blood loss or some gastric, intestinal, or a pancreatic disease. Assume a patient is having a chronic diarrhea. We are suspecting a malnutrition, or an undernutrition. Look at the CBC of the patient. If he's having an elevated mean corpuscular volume, it means he is having some B12 deficiency. So the probable malnourishment is involving a structure which is involved with B12 absorption. Remember, B12 absorption takes place in the intestine. So a patient with diarrhea and an elevated mean corpuscular volume could have a disease of the ileum. So even without looking at any endoscopy or without any imaging finding, we could localize where the probable lesion could be. Similarly, iron is commonly absorbed in the duodenum. Any patient with a chronic diarrhea, any patient with a diarrhea, without documented GI. Okay, we'll continue. So what I was telling is, any patient with, again, a chronic diarrhea without any GI blood loss, and he's having a low MCV, it could point to an iron deficiency, and we could localize the lesion could be to the duodenum, because duodenum is the site of iron absorption. So with just looking at the mean corpuscular volume from a CBC, we can localize where the site of lesion could be. And elevated total count with the GI symptom, elevated ESR and CRP points towards inflammation like inflammatory bowel disease. Elevated urea and creatinine, electrolyte imbalance, acid-base disturbance all occurs with vomiting and diarrhea. Abnormal LFT, abnormal amylase and lipase. Abnormal amylase and lipase is seen with some disease like pancreatitis and cirrhosis. Always look for urine pregnancy test in any female with abdominal symptom, because pregnancy with some complication like a torsion, etc., can present with abdominal pain and can mislead the diagnosis. This is about the basic investigation. And once we have come to a particular diagnosis, we can go for specific investigations like tumor markers, hormonal assays, and specific serologies like anti-GAD antibody, anti-gliadin antibody in celiac disease, etc. And any patient with ascites, we should look for ascitic fluid analysis. And stool analysis is a very good non-invasive method for looking at anything which is happening within the lumen. We can look for parasites, we can look for ovocyst. A presence of leukocytes means the patient is having some infection in the GI tract. We can look for specific antigens like GID antigen. We can look for electrolytes which can guide us in identifying where is the site of origin of diarrhea. And fecal calprotectin and fecal lactoferrin are inflammatory markers. If they are elevated, it means the diarrhea is due to an inflammatory bowel disease, and it may not be infected. So starting from basic CBC, to a simple stool analysis can guide us in coming to a diagnosis without going for some deeper investigations. And whenever we speak of GI, there's something which comes to our mind is endoscopy. Yeah, endoscopy for everything. Upper GI endoscopy or OGD-scopy, sigmoidoscopy, where we can visualize up to the transverse colon, colonoscopy, where we can visualize up to the distal ileum. So upper GI endoscopy visualizes the esophagus, the stomach, and the first two parts of the duodenum. So we have visualization till the upper two parts, and we have visualization till the ileum. We don't have any visualization of the duodenum to the duodenum and the ileum. So for that, we use something called as capsule endoscopy. Some special techniques of endoscopy include double balloon enteroscopy. One endoscopic procedure is endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography, where this is an endoscopy to look for the biliopancreatic duct. We can do ultrasound endoscopically also, that is endoscopic ultrasound. This is one investigation to look for pancreatic tumors, pancreatitis, etc. So some newer endoscopic techniques are also used. Rather than just visualizing, we can do some chromoendoscopy or confocal laser endomicroscopy or optical coherence tomography, so that we can have a non-invasive histopathology. Just by looking through these newer techniques, we can find out whether the patient is having some pre-malignant lesions, etc. So one specific investigation for any GI disorder will be an endoscopy. The question always comes whether to do an endoscopy or whether to do a barium studies. The question is both can be done simultaneously, but there are a few differences, few advantages and disadvantages. The barium also can localize any disease from GIT, like barium swallows look for any swallowing difficulties in esophagus. A barium follow through can visualize the intestine. Barium enema can visualize the colon. But the thing is, a GI scopy, rather than just visualizing, can also be used for doing some diagnostic tests such as a biopsy, can also be used for doing some therapeutic procedures. Hence, endoscopy is preferred compared to imaging. Imaging is superior compared to endoscopy, where minor abnormalities within the lumen, such as mucosal folds, etc., can be better seen in barium studies compared to OGD scopies. The other imaging will be ultrasound, CT guided by CT, where we look for solid organs. We can also look for luminal structures which are not visualized by contrast, like the intestine. Then some newer investigations will be a CTR MR enterography. They have replaced endoscopy completely now. So barium is outdated, endoscopy even now is outdated. If the patient is not willing for an endoscopy, we can non-invasively do a CTR MR enterography, where we can look at the lumen similar to an endoscope. The only disadvantage is we cannot have a tissue diagnosis with CTR MR enterography. Similarly, CTR MR angiography can diagnose some mesenteric ischemia, vessel diseases. Radionucleotide scans is the next level. They can help in localizing bleeding sites. Remember, an endoscopy needs at least 100 ml of bleed to localize it. Whereas a radionucleotide scan, even a 0.5 ml of bleed can be localized. Another radionucleotide scan will be in biliary scintigraphy. It's used to diagnose cholecystitis. So starting from a basic X-ray, barium scans to nuclear scans can be used in GIT. So histopathology, many of the diseases will require a histopathology, be it a neoplasm, be it an inflammatory disease, be it an infective disease, may need an endoscopic luminal biopsy to confirm it. For a solid organ, we use some image-guided biopsies. We have done some structural tests till now, like endoscopy or imaging, but there are some specific tests to look for the functions also. Like esophageal manometry, I told you achalasia is a disease of esophageal motility. So to look at pressures within the esophagus, we use esophageal manometry. It can measure the function of the muscle in esophagus. For small intestinal pseudo-obstruction, we can look for small intestinal manometry. Similarly, any patient complaining of constipation or fecal incontinence, we can look for anorectal manometry. Similarly, biliary colic, we look for biliary manometry. The tests have gone to the next level, that malabsorption can be diagnosed just by a breath hydrogen test. If the patient is having carbohydrate intolerance, we give them carbohydrate. The excess bacteria there or the The malabsorption will cause abnormal digestion and more of hydrogen will be, less of hydrogen will be released. The amount of hydrogen will be quantified non-invasively to find out whether the patient is really having some malabsorption or not. Similarly, urea breath test is one test which is used for H. pylori infection, for diagnosing H. pylori infection. So these are the summarizing the infection from a basic CBC to endoscopy to imaging to biopsy or to some non-invasive tests. The tests are progressed. So the treatment of any GI disease can be classified in 5 categories. I told you food has a closer relationship to any symptom of GIT. So reducing the food intake can modify the symptom. Changing the food can modify the symptom. That's called nutritional manipulation. We have set of drugs in GIT that comes under pharmacotherapy. And since I told you gut dysbiosis is one important entity, which is an upcoming talk, which is an upcoming theory. It is said that most of the diseases of GIT is caused by gut dysbiosis. So changing the bacteria of the GIT is one therapy which is suggested. And invasive procedures include endoscopic and radiographic treatment methods and surgery. So some examples of nutritional manipulation include, remember, lactose intolerance. Patient having lactase enzyme deficiency will have diarrhea. So avoid lactose in the diet, patient will not have diarrhea. Similarly, in gastroparesis, rather than taking solid food, advise liquid food so that gastric motility can be increased. In dumping syndrome, avoid carbohydrate. There's one specific food called FODMAPs, oligo-dinucleotide monosaccharide and polyols diet. It's a specific name given to it. It's a specific diet given in inflammatory bowel syndrome. Gluten aggravates celiac disease. So gluten-free diet is given in celiac disease. The thing is, celiac disease, we all know it can cause ataxia, it can cause myoclonus. This gluten-free diet itself can reduce ataxia. It itself is the treatment of ataxia. So one specific diet called elimination diet is given in eosinophilic esophagitis. In short bowel syndrome, fats will not be digested. So we supplement them with medium chain triglycerides. If the patient is not able to take any feed, if there's an esophageal disease, we do a gastrostomy to give the food through the stomach. If the patient is having a gastric disease, we put a hole through the jejunum and give the food through the jejunum. If the patient cannot be fed enterally at all, we give IV hyperalimentation. The pharmacotherapy, the common things which we all know, H2 blockers and PPI for any for any acid hypersecretion. Antidiarrheals are there, prokinetics are there, laxatives we have, antibiotics and antiemetics. Anti-inflammatory agents are important because I told you change in immune response is one therapy for is one mechanism involved in inflammatory bowel disease. And conventional and alternative medicines still have a place in traditional medicine. Whenever the patient has a GI symptom, rather than coming to us, they commonly go to a local practitioner where they get prescribed with some herbal medicines, which itself can cause some other liver diseases. It could be a cause of acute liver failure also. So I told you about gut dysbiosis. So there are some therapies targeting dysbiosis also. The basic instinct here is we have to increase the amount of beneficial bacteria and reduce the amount of abnormal bacteria. So giving non-absorbable antibiotics to destroy the unwanted bacteria can prevent diarrhea or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Similarly, giving excess of beneficial bacteria can also prevent diarrhea. So that is the role of prebiotic and probiotic. That is the role of non-absorbable antibiotic, like oral vancomycin, etc. Now the thing has advanced is fecal transplant is one newer therapy which is suggested, which is commonly given now for recurrent refractory Clostridium difficile colitis. The endoscopic and radiographic treatment methods, I told you endoscopy is better than imaging because it is both diagnostic and therapeutic. The simple NG which we put is also a therapeutic maneuver because just a Ryle's tube can quantify the amount of bleed in a GI bleeding, can decompress the upper gastrointestinal tract in the case of intestinal obstruction. So in sense, this has a therapeutic value also. And we know the other therapies, endoscopic variceal ligation, endoscopic mucosal resection of small polyps or tumors, endoscopic sphincterotomy is done in achalasia cardia, and something called as peroral endoscopic myotomy, again for achalasia. And all bariatric procedures now are endoscopic rather than open procedures. So this is about endoscopy. And I told you about angiography. like scintigraphy can diagnose a small bleed where it is occurring. We can embellish that place by angiography again. Percutaneous transhepatic catheterization is one therapy used in cholecystitis. TIPS is an interventional radiology procedure used in advanced hepatic encephalopathy. Lithotripsy for gallstones is again a non-invasive procedure. So others, which is beyond our scope, which is surgery. So what till now we have discussed is the investigations of any GI disease starts from the basic to the extreme, and the therapy is also classified under these 5 categories. Always think of nutritional modification, always think of pharmacotherapy, always think of endoscopic treatment, and if not, go for surgery. And the last point which I want to stress here is psychological therapy. GI is so complicated that the brain is connected to the gut through the enteric nervous system. Remember, vagus nerve comes out through the brain. Vagus nerve has a control on the intestine. Vagus nerve controls the enteric nervous system. So the central nervous system through peripheral nervous system is controlling the enteric nervous system here. And remember, GABA, serotonin, peptide YY, etc. are neurotransmitters present in the brain. These are common mediators which are targeted in any psychiatric disease. The same thing is present in intestine. That is to say, any change in the brain, any change in psychiatry can also cause GI disturbances. If you look back at history, Kaplan and Sadat psychiatry textbook tells us that the initial aspects of psychosomatic medicine began with looking at the GI tract. Any patient with GI symptom, if they don't have any organic lesion, it was thought to be psychiatric. So when it was investigated further, it was found out that it is actually a different entity which is called a somatization disorder or somatoform disorders. So concluding, GIT is not simple as we think because it is very complicated. The entire microbiology here is going to change the treatment. Like fecal transplantation is an upcoming procedure which is changing the entire GI system itself now. The entire psychiatry is also now dependent on the GI symptom because one of the criteria to diagnose somatoform disorders, the patient should have 2 GI symptoms in multiple pain syndrome. That is what is given here as functional GI disorder. If the patient is not having any organic lesion, the patient will have abnormal dysbiosis, the patient will have abnormal hormones, the patient will have abnormal enteric nervous system. So all this has to be targeted. That is the aim of treating an irritable bowel syndrome through hormonal mediation or through changing of enteric nerve. So this is about today's class. Thank you.